All right, we might get started with our last session for the day. As I understand, you guys have been here since 2 o'clock, I believe, going through all things disasters. And the last session really is going to be an interesting one. What we're looking at is, what does preparedness, what does recovery look like in the disaster context? And part of what our panel will unpack for us today is really looking at, if we understand that disasters really are the nexus of all things, if we understand that, disaster risk reduction and tackling systemic disaster risk is going to take that collaborative and partnerships approach, then we're going to have a diverse range of people in the room. And that's what we've got with our panel today. We're going to be discussing all of those issues in the preparedness and recovery phase and looking at, again, what does that collaboration and what does those partnerships look like? And as we enter this new world of disasters, the disaster landscape, as many of you would be aware here, is changing around us. What do we need to be doing now to affect change into the future? So before I get started, I might introduce our three panelist members. How we're going to run this afternoon is that we've got three panelists with us who I'll introduce. They're then going to give you a 5-minute burst presentation. And that's really just to set the scene for the conversation. So each of them will come up here, give their 5-minute burst presentation, and then we'll head to the lounge and we will have a conversation. And then also a big part of today, if we're talking about collaboration and partnership, please feel free. This is a collaborative session for you guys to ask questions. And for those online as well, please participate in this and ask some questions. As you can see behind me, Vvox is the platform we're using here. And I know that you've been using it already this afternoon. So please submit your questions. There will be time at the end to do that. So with no further ado, I might go through and introduce our three panelists, and then I'm going to start with Annie, who will be with us on Zoom, who will start the first burst presentation. And forgive me, I want to read these because I want to get these right, because we have three distinguished individuals with us today to share their experiences. So Annie Kia lives near Lismore and has a background in community organising and population health. She developed the Gasfield-free community strategy and scaled this nationally for Lock the Gate Alliance. Prior to this, she co-developed Sustain Northern Rivers, a regional collaboration of peak organisations to address climate change. In 2018, Annie was awarded the Ngari Activist of the Year Award for empowering communities to resist invasive gas fields and coal. The infamous Dr. David Caldicott is also with us this afternoon, emergency consultant and senior clinical lecturer at the ANU College of Health and Medicine. He is a spokesperson for the Australian Science Media Centre on issues of illicit drug use and the medical response to terrorism and disaster. And something that I'm fascinated with, David is currently completing his European Masters in Disaster Medicine. And finally, Cherie Gray is the global lead for sustainability and market development with Swiss Re Group. Cherie works with governments, institutions, NGOs, and the insurance industry to create opportunities that support nature-based solutions and broader sustainability practices. Now, what we might do is we might launch into Annie's burst presentation, and she will be on the screen for you. Over to you, Annie.
Hi, everyone. I wish I was there in person, but fortunately we have Zoom. I speak to you from Widjabul Wyabul country, and I live at the Channon. I'm speaking to you from the Channon, which is a village about 20 minutes north or 20 kilometres north of Lismore. In about 2008, I developed that collaboration of peak regional organisations. I co-developed it to address climate change in the Northern Rivers. I had no idea that in just 10 years, we would begin a disaster sequence here. Major flood in 2017, 2019 fires, and then the extreme rain in February that left our landscape broken and the city of Lismore in ruins. So throughout all this, communities self-organised solutions. We started strong. When the 2017 flood hit, the community was highly networked and full of agency. We just stopped coal seam gas fields with a mass movement campaign. Networks are the soft infrastructure of innovation, resilience, and well-being. Out of this networked agency, the community effort called Helping Hands arose very fast and is well documented. During the 2019 fires, locals organised community defender teams within the fireground. This innovation stopped fire reaching Nimbin and the Channon here where I live. Then in February this year, extreme rain broke our region and the city of Lismore. Up at Terrania, up here, a local measured 930 millimetres in 18 hours. The impact was catastrophic. Roads, bridges, hillsides were broken. People were trapped and isolated with no phone, no internet, no functional roads, and no functional regional city or local government. We were deep in DIY territory. We invented our way out of it as best we could, assessing roads and needs and getting people their food, fuel and medications. All around the Northern Rivers, communities did this. The community response in Lismore was amazing, starting with the citizen rescues. Australia's Indigenous newspaper, the Koori Mail, morphed into a relief centre next to the Wilson River. To enter the city was like entering a dystopian movie. Then others arrived to set up Trees Not Bombs Cafe in a big tent near the wrecked art gallery. Here, people could get free, nourishing meals, and most of all, a place to sit under shelter, to talk and hear each other and make sense of their experiences. The cafe had to decamp for the second flood, and as they were re-establishing the tent, they were told, no, 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 this is forbidden, go away. But they got past this impediment and stayed for 3 months. Stories, poetry, music was shared in that space, doing more for mental health than a huge team of health professionals could hope to achieve. When the disaster struck, Resilient Lismore Helping Hands started coordinating with volunteers. I'm in awe of them. The current focus is to get 2 habitable rooms in each home. My partner participates in these teams that strip and reline the walls and ceilings. The collateral well-being that flows from this is immeasurable. I'm told that at the 7-month mark, this community organisation has just had the first government dollar land in its bank account. Grief, loss, anxiety, and grace are threaded through the city. Other feelings are present. 4 weeks after the mega flood, and as the second flood was starting, I walked to the shed housing the creek and rain gauge at the Channon. It was still covered in flood debris. The gauges weren't working. I started asking questions and discovered a dog's breakfast whereby multiple organisations jointly mismanage the catchment monitoring system. Gauges were not maintained, spare parts were not stockpiled. Even now, trees obstruct important rain gauges. During the first flood, the metre of rain that fell at the headwaters of Terrania Creek up here was missed because the failing rain gauge up there, the official gauge, it had been failing all last year and it hadn't been fixed. The institutional and systemic failures that I discovered shocked me. I've recently dug out a copy of that Sustain Northern Rivers climate change collaboration, and it uses phrases like, the signatories accept their separate and collective responsibility to offer leadership to the people of the Northern Rivers region to take action now to prepare for and meet the challenges of climate change. "26 peak regional organisations were involved in that and put their signatures on it. Are institutions less capable now than they were when they signed onto those obligations? What's happened in the meantime? Have they been hollowed out by neoliberalism, ossified by managerialism? Meanwhile, here in the Channon, we're growing a CB emergency radio network and a flood safety project involving catchment sentinels for the safety of those downstream. Communities like ours will continue with these resilience efforts, but round here I see problems. For a start, we no longer have the key road that enabled our 2019 community fire defence. A section of it slid down the hill up here. It could take 2 years before we get it back. Communities can innovate their socks off, but we need public institutions. I know bureaucracies are difficult. I used to work in one of the biggest of them called New South Wales Health. Innovation happens when people meet to problem solve and persist in the problem solving. Business as usual is not ethical. We need institutions that are fit for purpose and that liberate the collective intelligence of the good people that work in them. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Annie. Now, I would like to bring up David next, and then after David, Cherie, if you want to follow.
Smash. Now, I got some pretty pictures to show you, and I don't know how to make them go. Let's see. Are you going to make them go, or am I going to make them go? Good. Oh, you'll have to see me do it through interpretive dance if you don't work this out. Is that working now? Is that working? There we go. Fantastic. I'm David. Delighted to meet you all. Thank you very much for the opportunity to chat with you. And I've been asked to give you a quick spiel about healthcare responses to the climate emergency. And I guess, you know, before we sort of get into the beef of it, we need to sort of have some idea of where we're at now, to work out what our capacity is. What are things going in the healthcare service in Australia right now? I don't know if you've noticed, I've put together a disaster for you. I did this. This was 3 years ago, purely to stress the system. I believe I've succeeded. We're in the middle of a plague, and I can tell you right now, freely, that we're empty. We're absolutely gutted. The healthcare system is broken. There's nothing left to give. Sure, I mean, there's nice people who draw lovely cartoons. This is Banksy. Banksy did a lovely picture for us. We're superheroes. Other cartoonists are doing lovely things. They're clapping their hands, and it's really good. And it changes nothing regarding the service that we can provide you. This is what it actually looks like. This is what broken healthcare people look like. This is what 16 hours in a mask and a gown looks like. And that is all around Australia. And for people to tell us that everything is over and everything is fine is, of course, nonsense. Here's another friend of mine. This is 747. This is the fattest bear in North America this year. The climate is affecting bear sizes. Because of climate change, rivers are diminishing, disappearing. And so salmon are forced in one area and can't get anywhere else. 747 has eaten all the salmon, as you can see. And this is where you want your healthcare system to be, with a lot of fat on it. This is where our healthcare system is at the moment post-COVID. There is no fat. This is what happens when you try to deliver just-in-time Bunnings or Coles type healthcare. It don't work. It don't work particularly in the context of plague, disaster, and epidemic. I don't have to tell you any of this stuff. You know this stuff already. Anna Greta Hunter, who works with us, will tell you all about climate change and heart disease. You're all going to die. We're either going to boil you, we're going to choke you, or we're going to drown you. That's what climate change is going to do to you. There's no way you can avoid it unless you do something about climate change. The consequences are massive and will put further burdens on our healthcare system. This is from the Sydney local health district. Not only the immediate medical consequences, but the interaction with the social consequences, which will then go on to further affect the healthcare system. One of the narratives that I love, and that one of our earlier speaker spoke to, is this narrative that's changed now. We're not going to fix this for you. You're all on your own. It's your responsibility to deal with the mess that we've made. And this is all what's being portrayed to health, to communities in flood-stricken areas. You can sort this out yourselves. One of the things that we do in medicine is talk about problem solving, because a lot of medicine is problem solving. My area of medicine is critical problem solving. So do we know what this problem is? Is there an answer? Is it a crisis? I'm there. That's for me. I love that. That's a crisis. Fantastic. Does anybody know the answer to this question? No? Nobody at all? A wicked problem. Fantastic. That's climate change. And everywhere in between there is something banal, that can be addressed. Find the person who has the answer, go and address the answer. Yeah. So these are how we think about our problems on the emergency shop floor. This is something that I tell my juniors in terms of how we should address our problems. So those critical problems that require a tactical response and command when we respond to them. The wicked problems require everyone who has a solution. It's like a disco ball. Everybody's got a piece of mirror that needs to be tagged on, and you will not have an answer until everybody addresses the problem. And in between, so that's leadership. We need leadership to address wicked problems. And managers, and so, for example, the public service, they're the people who should be dealing with the banal, the day-to-day, the continuity of things. The problem is, of course, is that the critical problem solvers are all broken at the moment. I haven't a clue where the leaders are. There are no leaders. They're absent, missing in action. And this central bit here, what used to be a very efficient Australian public service, has been completely gutted and is now managed by managerial companies and advisory groups and whatnot. It's just not there anymore. One of the things we saw in COVID and are still seeing is, now that COVID is over, it's very important that we learn to live with it. And the people who are telling you that are not the doctors who are getting mullered in the actual emergency departments. It's the people making money when COVID finishes. There's a lot of overlap there between the people who are delaying the changes necessary for addressing climate change. It's the same group of people. So what we've got is a group of politicians who don't want to see what's happening around us. A group of doctors who are actually gagged and disciplined should they speak up about any of these things. And a public that's had far too much bad news in the last few years to want to hear any more bad news whatsoever. You might argue there's no solutions whatsoever. We're all doomed. We might as well kill ourselves now. But I think there's probably some things that we could do. The first thing is stop this. Just stop it. Everything is not awesome. Everything is shit at the moment, and you need to live up to that. You need to own that. The politics, the business of the cycle of the electoral process means that it's doom for anyone to say, no, this is really bad, we need to address it. But that's what needs to be done. What you see now is this foolish consistency, this foolishness of people saying, it'll be fine, be lovely, it'll be grand. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, little people without the imagination to address these desperate, wicked problems. And so when we're dealing, say, for example, with a pediatric patient in front of us, and everything looks awful, you don't step off and say, should be grand. You embrace the suck. This is a military term. It comes from the Navy SEALs. We use it often in emergency medicine. You deal with the problem, embrace it, and do not walk off from it. So we need to learn how to embrace this suck, both as a community and as a political body when we're talking to our political colleagues. One of the biggest problems we're seeing, both with COVID, both with disaster due to climate change, is this business of groupthink. Lots of people, all in the same mindset, trying hard to do the right thing, but converging on the same easiest solutions, which almost by definition will not work. Embrace anyone who's in your organization, who's a devil's advocate, listen to what they say. Listen to the dissent. It wasn't until the end of 2020 that we all managed to persuade politics that COVID-19 was in fact a respiratory disease that was passed on through airborne transmission. It took an entire year because of the groupthink of that. Exactly the same thing is happening in disaster response. Teams are teams that will take your plan and tell you why it's crap. And when that team can no longer tell you why your plan is crap, then that plan is ready for deployment. You need to test your plan rather than assume that it's all okay. And all of your plans for everything need to be tested to breaking. There's no point it's going to assume in a bad way, like in Lismore. The people who are making Lismore work are the previous speaker, not the people being deployed to Lismore. So to summarize, there's no easy solution. I'm terribly sorry. I wish I could be more cheerful, but I can't. What comes easy, what is cheerful, what is happy, it's not going to last. And what is going to last, what is going to work is 100%. It's not going to come easy. This is kind of a rebellion. It's a revolution. And there is a requirement for people to stand up and be counted. And I invite you and welcome you all to the rebellion. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, David. Well, I guess let me try and share some ways in which, we're trying to embrace the suck, right? I don't have any slides. I think we've seen enough of the trajectory, right? We know that climate change is driving an increase in frequency and severity of events, but it's also increasing the cost of economic losses, okay? So last year, Swiss Re calculated from the available data that the global economic loss for, I guess, weather events and nat cats was $280 billion US dollars. And only 40% of that was insured. So whilst 280 billion is a really big number, it's actually not the full story. So for example, last year, the Extreme Heat Alliance worked out that just in the US, 100 billion was being lost in terms of, infrastructure fails, lost productivity, hospital costs, loss of life. So if you think about it, there's 250 billion that we know about that's reported. There's another 100 billion just in the US that we're learning about. But then there's a whole lot of other stuff that we don't even report on or think about. Impacts to nature and biodiversity, impacts to mental health, communities, all of that. So we need to reduce our emissions, we need to reduce our consumption, we need to invest in mitigation, we need to invest in adaptation, and we need to build more resilient infrastructure, more resilient communities, and more resilient economies. So that's what the purpose is. That's what our vision is at Swiss Re. It's to make the world more resilient. So we work with private sector as well as public sector companies to reduce what we call the protection gap, which is the gap between what's insured and what's not. So we need insurance to remain accessible, affordable, and relevant. And even these floods again, are showing us that in a developed country like Australia, there are still so many assets that are exposed. There are still costs that aren't planned for and families without appropriate planning or protection. So we've spoken today about changing the mindset. I want you to change the mindset about insurance. And I want you to think about it as a tool that can be used for disaster mitigation, preparedness, and fast recovery. So insurance is traditionally seen as a tool to compensate, right? It absorbs shocks, it compensates you for loss and damage, but it can also help build resilience by reducing the risk, transferring risk, and smoothing volatility. So I guess 3 concepts to share with you. The first is about planning, right? If we actually include insurance in the planning and design stage, then we're actually reducing the risk. We can transfer that risk, which means that you've actually got funds to put into other things because you're going to transfer that risk away with an insurance cover. What the insurance also does is it makes projects more attractive to investors and lenders because it smooths out the volatility and reduces the risk. There's assurance that money will be there if things go wrong. Assurance that projects will be on time, on budget because of that financial support. The second concept is what's called parametric insurance. So this is an innovative index-based type of cover. It's actually a pre-agreed contract that pays out when a particular data point is triggered. So we usually design it with things like weather data, satellite data, remote sensing. And when it actually hits the agreed point, the claim's automatically triggered, right? So it's actually really fast, which means that cash can be available in weeks rather than months. So it's a really fantastic tool for emergency response, for quick recovery and early interventions. The last one is the traditional indemnity-based insurance. So this is what we have for our home and cars. This is what you see on the media, because this is what actually can take time. So it involves an independent loss assessment before the claim is paid. And, you know, like in Annie's space, the industry had to fly in loss adjusters from New Zealand just to deal with the number of claims that were there in Lismore. So if we think a bit more practically about the costs, we can actually use insurance as an innovative tool to support. And in addition, for the public sector, by actually transferring the risk to the private sector, it frees up capital that you can actually use for other stuff. And it actually hands over that risk to organisations that do this for a day job. You know, they've got the expertise, they've got the balance sheets to actually carry this risk. So, I mean, Rosalind told us earlier on that, you know, 98% of the disaster managed expenditure is actually done on recovery rather than upfront. So there's a great opportunity there just to redirect that funding and a role for insurance to support that for mitigation as well as quick recovery. Thank you.
So part of the conversation now is having a come closer. Is to have a bit of a panel discussion. And I've got a few questions, but as I said at the start, what I want you guys to do in the audience and here in the room as well is engage in the conversation. So Vivox is the platform. If you'd like to submit any questions, I've got a fancy device up here that I can see them, and we'll have some time at the end to have those questions. But to start with, Annie, I might ask the first question of you. Quite often we look at these disasters in this government-centric lens, but obviously, Annie, you have dedicated your life to looking at this through the community's eyes. What does that mobilizing communities, what does that community-centric approach looks like? So Annie, for our guests here, could you maybe unpack what does best practice look like in this space? But also, and I think you touched on it in your presentation, how do we get the interface right between governments and our governance structures and these community-centric approaches?
Okay, well, that's a great question. I think the engine of everything is actually action learning. Like whether we're in an institution or a community group or in the space between, it's action learning that delivers us the next steps that we have to take. And I think that's not dissimilar. It's kind of similar to what David was talking about, but everything we do, we have to examine it and allow ourselves to learn the best way forward through that process. So I think the action learning loop it's what went well, you know, what could we do differently? How is this going to fail? What helps and what hinders through what we've already done together? So I think that if we can create that space between the institutions and the communities, then in a very genuine way, then that is a strong way forward. And more than that, I think we need to actually, I think there is a tendency, and I've worked in big bureaucracies, I think there's a tendency to, you know, when we engage with communities to do it out of benevolence, you know, we have to do some community engagement. But actually, we need to recognise that the community space, the on-ground experience, is where important knowledge is generated. It is a place for knowledge generation. And so that's kind of a shift in attitude from a benevolent, oh, we must consult the community, to what learning can happen in this space. So it needs to be a collaborative thing between people in institutions and people at the community level. I think congruence is very important. And, you know, I was very moved by David's, having worked in the health service, very, very moved by what David said. And honestly, we just have to shift money to where it's needed. We have to stop subsidising coal and gas and giving public money to those entities. We have to stop the loopholes that enable global companies to siphon off money and not pay proper taxation. And we need to, return that money to the important public institutions that need to be able to function, like the health service and the other important institutions that we rely on, and also to the community development that we need. So, we just have to be frank about this. We need to redeploy monies in our system, and that involves some congruence.
Definitely, and I think that's a great lead in, Annie, to a question for you, David. As you said in your presentation, we've learned a lot from COVID in the healthcare system in that setting, especially in the disaster setting. And following on from what Annie said there in terms of, investment and changing, the paradigm or our mindset, you talked about almost this notion of a healthcare system being on the brink, being on the edge of a cliff. So, in your opinion, what do we need to do to bring it back today? How can we pull it back from the edge? But then, as you said about the bear, what are some of those strategies that we could be putting into the healthcare system to build that fat?
I don't know if we've got the time to answer that. So, look, I would reiterate everything that Annie has said, in that the solutions to these problems come from the people who are directly facing these problems. If you want to know what needs to be done in Lismore, ask the people in Lismore. Don't assume that you know what's going on in Lismore. From a healthcare perspective, you need to ensure that staffing, that education, that all the things that people got into healthcare for, the morale of camaraderie and teamwork, that is restored. Everything over the last decade, particularly in the pre-COVID era, the collapse of the healthcare system occurred in the decade that preceded COVID. COVID is like water. COVID infiltrated and then froze and broke everything where the cracks had been formed. So those cracks had formed already. So you need to repair all of that. The kicking of the GPs at the moment over Medicare is not helping, and it's probably not evidence-based. It's probably being driven by the likes of McKinsey or somebody else. So that sort of thing. Australia could deal with all of this in a cost-neutral way. It could cost nothing, as Annie was saying, if the right money was going to the right places at the right time. And at the moment, we're paying off big companies to do foolish stuff that in the end, it exacerbates the problems we're facing.
Yeah. So in terms of the healthcare system, if we don't put that fat on, what's the life cycle of it? What have we got left in the system?
Well, look at the NHS. So the NHS has now been foundered on rocks and is in a position to be dismantled, and an American healthcare system being put in to replace it. That's where the NHS has got itself to. The Australian healthcare system has been excellent. I trained in it partially. I work in it. I choose to work in it as a person who can work anywhere. But it will break. What you find is that the first thing to break is the goodwill. So a lot of healthcare systems around the world during COVID are functioning on the smell of an oily rag and the people within it trying to do the best thing. And that's the first thing that'll go. And you're seeing that already. People are talking about strikes. People are talking about leaving the profession. This is the canary that people need to start paying attention to.
So, Cherie, then, we've talked to David and I guess Annie as well around that. Really at the end of the day, we need to look at this from a multidimensional point of view. And obviously the private sector plays a big role in that. For you and your role, what do you think that private sector space genuinely looks like? Because I know there's, let's be honest, there's probably a healthy degree of skepticism when we talk about the private sector and disasters. But when you start to look at this paradigm to say, well, you know what, if there's an outcome for community and there's an outcome for business, then why not? Can you unpack that for us around what are your thoughts in that space?
Yeah, and there's, I guess, a couple of examples that I want to give to hopefully show that in action, because there's the sharing of expertise as well as the sharing of resources, and being able to, well, for the insurance industry anyway, about providing the cash for action. And so listening to you just made me think about an example, and it's also a good lesson in planning, right? Because the canary's dropping and we know that. So we know what's going to happen. And for example, years ago, this was some time ago now, we established a program with the World Health Organization, a pandemic facility, right? Because years ago, like before we even knew what a COVID was, right? We were looking at emerging risks and we recognized that this risk is out there. And so the World Health Organization were really concerned about how developing countries were going to be impacted by that. Okay. So we set up an insurance program with them that was actually going to be triggered by, I think, maybe number of infections, things like that. And that just sat there. They paid an annual premium. It was just kind of, it rolled over. It was just there as a precaution. And you know what? We were there. It's paid out, right? So there's a little bit of, I guess, investment, patience, planning, and foresight that's required for that to happen. The other example that I guess I want to share is when it comes to collaboration, particularly around adaptation, right, and building resilience. And so this example I also like is from the Netherlands, and it's from Texel Island, which, I mean, the Netherlands is practically underwater, like, below sea level anyway, right? And so there's this lovely little island. It's a World Heritage Site, and the dike needed to be reinforced, right? They had this concrete dike there. But what they decided to do, instead of just, reinforcing the concrete, they actually came up with this really cool nature-based solution, right? They were going to reinforce it with sand and planting, but because it was a World Heritage Site and there was a community and, oh my God, all these things can go wrong, how are we going to actually deal with this change? They could actually take out insurance for that, right? So they treated it like a commercial problem, okay? Like any other infrastructure. It wasn't like, oh, let's just do this little nature pilot. It was actually a commercial problem. And so you have the contractors in, you can provide kind of contract works. So firstly, kudos that they're actually planning and building something that creates resilience. But secondly, the collaboration between, it was the municipality that actually, sponsored it, and using the private expertise to actually enable that solution. And they've got extra benefits. There's like kind of, they've won an award for like best tourist site, but there's also improved aquaculture and fish benefits and things like that. So planning, collaboration, summarize.
And I think that's what, David, you were kind of talking about. It's about understanding who does what best and leveraging off those skill sets. I think that's a really fascinating thing that we all probably need to think about in the disaster space. Before we pass across to some audience questions, I just want to ask a question of the whole panel, and just given that the time that we have, maybe a minute, maybe 2 or 3 key things for you in this. But if we are going to accept the premise that disasters are not natural, that at the end of the day they are a result of decisions, investment decisions, things we have done as society and communities, what do we need to be doing up the front? And I think a lot of time when we move into that recovery space, we, again, as you said, David, we put our hero capes on and we want to fix everything. But I guess some of the issues that we see they're systemic issues. They've been in community for a very long time, like your healthcare analogy. They're cracks that have always been there, and the disaster is the water that freezes within there. So from you guys in your respective fields, what do we need to be doing up front how can we tackle some of these systemic issues? And I know this is a big space to unpack in a very short time, but how do we tackle some of those systemic issues up front rather than waiting for the disaster to happen to bring them to front of mind for us? And I might start with you, Cherie.
Yeah, because I guess the first thing that I'd recommend is, particularly for the public sector that has, funds, but a limited amount of funds, right? So work out the best things that you can do with them. And so if you've got a lump of money sitting there just in case stuff goes wrong, transfer that out. Give that to the private sector, give that to the insurance industry. That's what they do day to day.
Yeah.
Use that money to actually invest in mitigation and building resilience because, outsource what you can and get help where you can.
Yeah. David?
Look, this is my mother is going to sense me speaking blasphemy. But I'm going to say that the insurance companies have got an awful lot to contribute. And I'm waiting for lightning or something. I think what we have to do is we have to identify explicitly the cost of inaction. So if you can put a cost at what this is going to mean for us if we don't do something, then you can compare it to the cost that mitigating against that requires. And unfortunately, we've seen again and again and again, the provision of evidence to our elected representatives means nothing. But I suspect if you tell them that they're going to go broke if they don't do what we want, then that's important. The other thing that I would say, and it gets back to Anna, is this business of collaboration with people who know. There's a tremendous book that I might commend to you, if I may, called The Medici Effect by, I think it's Franz Jacobson from Harvard. And he speaks to Renaissance Italy, the Medicis, this extraordinary, powerful, phenomenally wealthy family, with not the slightest idea about how to do anything. So what did they do? They brought everybody in to do everything. They brought in the Da Vinci's and all these fantastic Renaissance artists and say, you know what, you sort this out because you know what's best here. We're going to create an extraordinary new world of collaboration, and you tell us what you need and we will provide you the funding to do so. And we need to get away from, this is what you're going to get, this is all you're going to get, make do with it, or even worse, you sort this out. I know we caused the problem, but it's up to you now to be resilient. What you need is you need to flip that completely so that it is the communities worst affected that are basically making the demands as to what is required to fix the problem. And so much more facilitation. I would guess that private industry would be interested more in that than maybe even our elected representatives. Yeah, it's very interesting. Annie, quickly over to you from a community perspective. What are two key things that you think we need to be doing in this space in the front end?
What comes to mind at the moment in this conversation is actually, I think our institutions need to be fit for purpose. And I think there is a lot that can be done to improve how institutions problem solve and deal with wicked problems. I was enormously grateful for when I worked in population health. We embraced and did a whole action learning thing on how can we use complexity thinking to get better bang for buck. And I think there is much that can be applied. A lot of people talk about complexity concepts, but very often it's not actually applied in institutions. But there is a way of doing that unleashes the collective intelligence of the people in these organisations, because very often these organisations have suffered from last century's managerialism, and have become ossified, and they have lots and lots of great people in them who are constricted. So I personally would like to see, I think that at the community level, the innovation is just going to all keep happening in that way. It's getting harder and harder as more disasters strike. But I do think it's really important for the institutions to embrace methodologies that release collective intelligence and enable effectiveness and I've used and benefited from immersing myself in a particular framework called the Cynefin framework, which informed all of my work with communities and organisations and stuff like this. But yeah, I'd like to see that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Annie. And I think it's a really good point. I know we've had Craig Fugate on the podcast before, and he talks about that often, we get stuck in a government-centric problem-solving methodology, and often we don't pull everything that we need into the room to actually have the right conversation. Now, we're almost up of time, but I do want to at least have one question from the audience, so I don't, no one can call me a liar this afternoon. I think, Cherie, I might throw this one to you, and I'm going to paraphrase this one, but it's talking about as the impacts of climate change, as we exacerbate, the environments and the hazards we face, obviously, largely the cost of risk is driven. Largely the cost is driven by the risk. Is there a point where insurance no longer becomes a sustainable solution? And if that's not the case, what else can we be looking at? Is that something that insurance companies can play in?
Yeah, I guess firstly, we've been talking about climate risk and sustainability for years and years and years before it was even cool, right? Before it was a thing. And so you go back kind of 20, 30, 40 years, we started to talk about this, because it is about making sure the industry is affordable, because the more events you have, it increases the premiums, because all of that data kind of, increases the probability, right? So it's just a simple formula, in and out. And so I guess, so firstly, we want to advocate, we want to support, we want to encourage also thinking about mitigation solutions, not just the compensation solutions. But you do see a lot more, I guess, creative things happening. So I spoke about like parametric index-based covers. You see a lot more kind of cat bonds, kind of insurance-linked securities, like all this cool stuff that people smarter than me, have developed. But then you also see, I guess, other things which can work when it's managing risks, like, for example, pools, right? So when you have homogeneous risks, when you have maybe municipalities or a group of hospitals or small islands, that can actually pool their risk to actually make it much more accessible to get the support that they need. So there's quite a lot of interesting stuff happening out there.
Thank you for sharing that with us. Look, we have sadly reached time, and I know that this is a fascinating conversation that, here in the room that we could have for hours and for days, no doubt, and online as well. But we have to finish because I've got the timekeeper holding the red card up to me. But just a few points to leave you with. One, take this back into your day jobs. What does collaboration and partnership look like for you? What can you do to be part of the solution in this problem when we're tackling systemic disaster risk? Or if you're supporting a community going through recovery, think about what that partnership and collaboration could look like. Please stay in tune with ANU as they continue these conversations. If you want to hear more conversations like this, a podcast that you can listen to is Me, Myself and Disaster, where we unpack some of those issues in disasters. What are the key things going on? And talk to people from around the globe around some of these issues. And also, just one other thing, the Australian Young Professionals in Disasters Network is trying to tackle this. It's a network of people looking at how we can bring youth into the fold to look at the disasters of tomorrow and what do we need to be doing now, but not just looking at people from government, looking at engineers, people from insurance companies, people from healthcare systems. How can we start the conversation right across the sector? Tonight also has been recorded, so please keep an eye out for that. Thank you for being with us this afternoon. If you've been here for the whole event, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it opened your mind, and thank you. And also thank you very much to our last panelists. It has been my pleasure to moderate the session and have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.